to 15 minutes, right? And I hope you all can hear me. You could just do a thumbs up. All right, good. I'm gonna ask, okay, so my slides are up. Thank you to the organizers, the JFC, US-ASEAN Business Council, ITB-PAP, Asia Cloud Computing Asia Internet Coalition for organizing this webinar, and also for the invitation. I apologize that Asik Alan Ehep, he cannot make the presentation himself. He is in Semarang attending the ASEAN meeting. I myself am back attending the meetings here in Seattle, but my schedule is friendlier, so here I am. Let me show you the first slide to cover, just to show you the outline of my presentation. So I'll be talking about the background, a brief context, the current regime on data governance, issues for consideration, and the international standards on managing data. So next slide, please. So just for context, data continues to play an important role. I'm sorry, by the way, I might have to turn off my video just to save on the data. So as I was saying, data continues to play an important role in today's economic landscape. And countries such as those in the Asia-Pacific region have adopted rules for data governance and cross-border data flows as elements, chapters of their bilateral and regional trade agreements. At the same time, there are no global governance frameworks, although there have been a few agreed international rules, norms in this area. I'll be talking about it later. With the COVID-19 pandemic, this has caused many shifts in relation to accelerating the trend toward digitalization. At the same time, it has brought about vulnerabilities, particularly in areas such as data collection, storage, security, and data flows. So there's previous research from the McKinsey Global Institute that found that in the long run, at least 10% of global GDP, worth at least 7.8 trillion in 2014, is dependent on flows. And some estimates put this figure as high as 40% just on data flows versus the flow of goods and trade or on capital people. So data really plays a big role. Okay. Next slide, please. While numerous examples of international and regional collaboration continue, it seems possible and of inward-looking policies will be both amplified and intensified by the current pandemic crisis that has gripped the world. So that's a quote from the OECD, who had a report in 2020 which said that data localization measures, there are around 40 jurisdictions who have done that, including the EU and countries in Africa, Asia, and Americas. And OECD have observed that data localization is being driven by countries' inward-looking policies, a trend which is amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not going to talk about this at length. I noted that Janos is is going to be one of the speakers. He's also a good friend of the Philippines. Also, we work closely with him. So he's going to be talking about this, the different reports that the OECD have produce on data governance. So just going to the next slide, data localization. I want to talk about this. So this refers to requirements for storing, processing, and moving data within geographic boundaries. Again, I use the OECD definition. And also in that study, the OECD have identified some reasons why countries adopt or plan to adopt data localization. So some concerns are to ensure the security of a country's data and to prevent data from leaving the country. Also to support law enforcement by enabling national authorities to access data needed for investigation of crimes. Also to develop the indigenous IT skill base, create a data center economy, which is actually also a strategy that is being adopted by the Philippines, as well as develop the local digital economy. And another consideration is to protect or improve citizens' individual privacy. Next slide, please. So for the Philippines, our regime, or at least our main law, is the Data Privacy 2021, which is considered as the first comprehensive law covering data privacy in the country. It was enforced on 8 September 2012, And the Act indicates that it is the policy of the state to protect the fundamental human right of privacy of communication while ensuring free flow of information with an end in view to promote innovation and growth, recognizing the vital role of communications technology in nation building and the inherent obligation of the state to ensure that personal data in the information and communication systems in the government and in the private sector is secured and protected. Okay. Next slide, please. Other relevant domestic laws and regulations related to data flows would be the quite a number of circulars and regulations by the Bangko Sentral, as well as those from the National Privacy Commission. So from the Bangko Sentral, this would be guidelines on electronic payments and also adoption of a financial framework, as well as multi-factor authentication. So a lot on the financial services side, because that's where most of the data are crossing the borders. And then on the NPC side, it would be mostly to continue to implement the Data Privacy Act, such as designation of data protection officers, as well as personal data breach management. So those are just some examples. There's a lot more. Next slide, please. So us in the DTI, when we engage in making rules on data or on data governance or disciplines, these are the things that we consider. What would be the implication of data sovereignty and data protection? So will data localization requirements increase the cost of doing business by forcing internet companies and online platforms to build redundant server locations? So under the DPA, there is actually no data export limitations which apply, except under the accountability regime, which makes a controller responsible and accountable for compliance with the Data Privacy Act, when data is disclosed to a third party, whether or internationally. And when we negotiate trade agreements, we always ask ourselves, how detailed would be the frameworks that we need to govern cross-border electronic commerce and data flows? And how can these international norms and protocols ensure the flow data? And do we need a forum for settling disputes when they arise? Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of international standards, there are rules on data governance already brought into force in major regional trade agreements and mega regional trade agreements. So two of them actually would be the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Philippines is not a member. So it contains a chapter on represents the most modern and comprehensive approach to data liberalization today. And among its provisions are measures that explicitly prohibit countries from requiring data to be stored on local servers. Also, it has restrictions on imposing duties on data flows and digital goods, as well as restrictions also on forcing service providers to share valuable source code with foreign governments or rival companies. So that's also a related issue on source code and algorithms. The chapter also sets standards for the use of digital authentication and signatures, and also requires the signatories to enact laws protecting consumers from unsolicited emails and other fraudulent online activity. The second one would be the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. Also, we're not a member, which entered into force in 2020, and it incorporates most of the the original TPP disciplines, because before CPTPP was the TPP, and then the US begged off, so it became CPTPP. So it incorporates most of the TPP disciplines on digital trade, but it goes further among them, defining the liability of intermediary service providers, as well as protecting non-disclosure of software source code and related algorithms. It also ensures the non-sensitive government data can be publicly available. So the USMCA is also an agreement that recognizes the APEC cross-border privacy rules, or the CBPR system, as a valid data transfer mechanism. So the Philippines as actually a formal member of the APEC CBPR, and I'm going to talk about that quickly later. All right. So next slide. The regional and mega-regional trade agreements that the Philippines is party to. So the most recent one would be the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, composed of member countries representing 30% of global GDP. And similar to the CPTPP, RCEP also includes an extensive e-commerce chapter. And this chapter provides significant exceptions, allowing regulatory restrictions on cross-border data flows that are actually effectively unchecked by a dispute settlement process. It also allows individual countries to deem when data localization requirements may be necessary. So the Philippines, yeah. So that is the most recent one. The other agreements we're party to are the ASEAN Agreement on E-commerce, which is ASEAN's oldest agreement on e-commerce. And this agreement is actually subject to dispute settlement, although the commitments have greater flexibility and broader exceptions. For instance, ASEAN is only obliged to work towards eliminating or minimizing barriers to the flow of information across borders, while data localization is prohibited subject to existing laws and regulations. So if you don't have them, then that means it doesn't apply. At the same, meanwhile, there is also no commitment to prohibit forced transfer of source code. Okay, so that is ASEAN, much older, and then a newer one, newer than the RCEP, would be the upgraded ANSFATA chapter on e-commerce, which is an external FTA of ASEAN with Australia and New Zealand. Actually, it has the most comprehensive e-commerce provisions to date, even greater than the RCEP. And with RCEP plus elements such as digital trade standards and conformity assessment, as well as provisions on e-invoicing, open government data, and application of dispute settlement, you would consider stronger commitments on online personal information protection and also online consumer protection, among others. So this is a milestone in itself, as ASEAN is actually, the ANSFATA is ASEAN's only FTA with e-commerce provisions before the RCEP. And unlike the ASEAN Agreement on E-commerce, where all commitments are subject to dispute settlement, the upgraded ANSFATA chapter on e-commerce protects security exception commitments on cross-border data flow and data localization from being called into dispute. Okay. Next slide, please. So other international standards, I would call them standards or rules, although they're non-binding in nature, would be the APEC CBPR system, cross-border privacy rules. This is a voluntary accountability-based system that facilitates privacy-respecting data flows among APEC economies. Through the National Privacy Commission, we became a member in 2020, and also it led to the NPC chairing the Global Privacy Assembly COVID-19 Task Force, which aims to guide 134 jurisdictions around the world in enabling effective government response to the pandemic while continuing to protect citizens' personal data and privacy. The Philippines has also signed on to other regional and international commitments, such as the WTO Declaration of Global E-commerce, the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce. It's not listed there. It's not listed there in detail, as well as the other ASEAN related standards, including the ASEAN Framework on Personal Data Protection and the ASEAN Framework on Digital Data Governance. Actually, the ASEAN Framework on Digital Data Governance, which lists out 4 strategic principles and priorities, is very comprehensive. If you have time to look at it, it is a very, very useful reference. Okay, so next slide, please. Bilaterally, we have also engaged with Singapore, firstly with the United Kingdom. The National Privacy Commission signed a memorandum of understanding with the UK to ensure robust data privacy enforcement, as well as exchange best practices in governance, policymaking, and enforcement. And then we have also an MOU on personal data protection with Singapore's Personal Data Protection Commission on sharing best practices in personal data protection. Okay, so those are two important bilateral engagements. Next slide, please. So these are what's keeping us busy now at the DTI. These are continuing rule setting on data under the Digital Trade or E-commerce Agreement or chapter. So firstly would be the WTO Joint Statement Initiative, wherein we are coming up, we're hoping to conclude an agreement, multilateral agreement on e-commerce. This agreement will have sections on openness and e-commerce, trust and e-commerce, and so on. So we joined the JSI in 2019 in January. Negotiations are currently ongoing in small groups, as reflected on the slide. And among their provisions, for instance, include the flow of information, which aims to ensure cross-border data flows to facilitate trade, provisions on data localization, data privacy, source code, and ICT products that use cryptography. The other one we're engaged in is in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, which has a digital chapter pillar. Some of the texts are patterned after the CPTPP, which have so it will have provisions on the promotion of consumer trust, trusted flow of data across borders, data privacy, and so on. So the views of the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a means to deepen integration with global supply chain. To those who are not familiar with the IPEF, it was launched by US President Biden last year, and it actually seeks to boost US economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. So other IPEF participants include Australia, Brunei, Fiji, India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. So in the trade pillar, where the digital trade chapter is being discussed, India is not it's not among the parties. They're only they're only partners or parties in the other pillars, not trade. And then there's the ASEAN Digital Economic Framework Agreement, or DEFA, which will be ASEAN's most comprehensive agreement on e-commerce and digital economy. So the DEFA hopes to transform ASEAN into a leading digital economy through 9 core elements on digital trade, cross-border e-commerce, payments and invoicing, digital ID and authentication, online safety and cybersecurity, cross-border data flows and data protection, competition policy, cooperation on emerging topics, talent mobility, and cooperation. So these are very important elements, and the DEFA negotiations will be launched this year. Okay, so that ends my presentation. I hope to stay as long as possible to wait for any questions, but I need to go to another meeting, a reception that's being hosted for us. So I'm sorry that if I cannot answer your questions, but please leave them in the chat box. My colleague is going to be staying on, Attorney Dior from BITS there, and also Micah, and they will consolidate any of the questions. We will try to answer that. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Assistant Director Sherilyn. I think based on your presentation, it's clear that the issue of cross-border data flow and data localization is really becoming increasingly important in a lot of our current and ongoing trade negotiations. So thank you. I think it's very important that you spoke at this event, and we understand that given the difference in time zones, it'll be hard for you to stay on until later, but we appreciate you staying on as much as you can. And as mentioned, we encourage everyone to use the Q&A function. You can put in your questions now, and maybe some of our speakers can answer them through through the function. And later on, we can also cite some of the questions there during our panel discussion and Q&A. So thank you again, Assistant Director. So now we move on to our next speaker. Ms. Janelyn Macalinao is the Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Lead of the Cybersecurity Bureau of the Department of Information and Communications Technology. She was awarded the Certified in Cybersecurity credential by the International Information System Security Certification Consortium in January of this year, and she is an alumna of the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Garmisch, Germany. Jenilyn, if you're ready, I'll hand over the floor to you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Apologies, I'll try to see if my bandwidth would allow turning on my video. Okay, so if I may be allowed to share my screen. All right. So again, a pleasant morning to everyone. Unfortunately, this was supposed to be delivered by the Director of the Cybersecurity Bureau. However, he's currently in an urgent meeting, so I'm here to represent him on this forum. So I'll be presenting the National Cybersecurity Plan 2028, and in relation also to our topic this morning, which is cross-border data flows. Okay, so first, allow me to share the Declaration of Core Principles of the National Cybersecurity Plan 2028. We would like to emphasize that cybersecurity as a core principle is a shared responsibility between the national government, its citizens, and between the public and private sectors. Also, government-enacted policies and technological controls must always be centered in building anchors of trust. We also want to emphasize that public-private partnerships are valued, and policies that promote the building of an ecosystem of responsible cybersecurity actors among industries are prioritized. Another core principle is that transparency and communication between all parties and sectors is key in cybersecurity. Next, we would want to ensure that security and privacy by design is collectively adhered to, and that security must be built through a process from inception to destruction until retirement. Also, a risk-based and standard-based approach to cybersecurity is adopted, and internationally accepted norms in ethical behavior, in cyberspace are adhered to, and the government aspires to be a responsible member of the international community working for cybersecurity. The mission statement of the National Cybersecurity Plan 2028 is ensuring a trusted, secure, and reliable cyberspace for every Filipino. The mission is, of course, first is trusted ecosystem. We would want to create an ecosystem in the cyberspace where every Filipino trusts the information system and actors in it. Next is secure. We want to realize a secure cyberspace, showing the commitment of the national government to protect and safeguard critical information assets of both the private and the public sectors. And of course, we want a reliable ecosystem where quality products assure services are within their advertised levels. So allow me to discuss the scope of cybersecurity and the National Cybersecurity Plan 2028. First, it covers all activities in the cyberspace of Filipinos, regardless of the physical location of said citizen. Second, activities that directly or indirectly access any cyberspace resource whose physical location is within the territorial jurisdiction of the Republic of the Philippines. This would include all data assets, such as but not limited to servers, data storage, data at rest, data in transit, network equipment, and others. And it also covers any information asset that is transmitted through network devices and cables located within the jurisdiction of the country. So what are the pillars of the National Cybersecurity Plan? We would first is the enactment of a Cybersecurity Act to strengthen the policy framework. We would also want to secure, of course, and protect critical information infrastructures or CIIs, proactively defend our government and our people in cyberspace. We want an operational and well-coordinated network of computer emergency response teams and Security Operations Center or SOC to capacitate as well our workforce in cybersecurity and to enhance international cooperation. Okay, now allow me to share the ICT Department Circular 10 series of 2020, which amended the earlier issued the ICT DC 002 series of 2017, prescribing the Philippine government's cloud-first policy. So in that circular, you will see in section 1.3, data classification standards. So there are four. We have a classification of highly sensitive government data. In this case, this type of data may be stored or processed in the cloud only when necessary, in which case the government agency shall utilize a secure private cloud hosted in on-premise infrastructure that is within the Philippine territory or in other territories over which the Philippines exercises sovereignty. This would include our Philippine embassies and consulates. The next classification is above sensitive government data. In this case, this data may be stored and processed in the cloud, in which case the government agency shall utilize accredited public cloud hosted in-country infrastructure or the Philippine Gov Cloud. Now, the government agency has the option in its sound discretion to allow above sensitive data that store or process in in-country infrastructure to be likewise stored as well in offshore infrastructure if the objective is to ensure resiliency through redundancy. The next classification is sensitive government data. This type of data may be stored in the cloud, in which case the government agency shall utilize accredited public cloud, whether in-country or offshore, or the Philippine Gov Cloud. And we have the non-sensitive government data, which includes all open data, publicly accessible data, and the likes. Government agencies may store or process these using accredited cloud service providers, whether in-country or offshore, or in the Philippine Gov Cloud. It's important to note that the provision on data sovereignty in Section 12.1 states that all data created, collected, organized, modified, retrieved, used, consolidated, sourced from, or owned by the Philippine government, including all its agencies, which are in the cloud, regardless of location, shall be governed by Philippine laws policies, rules, and regulations. And except as otherwise permitted under Philippine law, no such data shall be subject to foreign laws or be accessible to other countries. This is regardless of the cloud deployment model used or the nationality of the CSP, regardless also of the data's place of storage, processing, or transmission. Okay, I believe this would be the last slide. Should we have questions, I believe we can entertain later after the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenilyn, for your presentation. Thank you also for agreeing to stay on for questions later. I think it's very important that we get inputs from the ACT, and especially on cybersecurity on this issue, as it's one of the policy considerations for cross-border data flow. Now we're going on to our next speaker. I'd like to thank Shannon Ko for dialing in from the US. But just a quick introduction. Shannon Ko is the Director of Global Data Policy in the US Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration. In this capacity, she leads a team that focuses on policy issues affecting cross-border data flows that support international trade, including in multilateral fora such as APEC, the OECD, G20, and the G7. Shannon leads the U.S. delegation, the APEC Digital Economy Steering Group, has served as chair of the APEC Data Privacy Subgroup and E-commerce Steering Group, and oversees the U.S. efforts to implement the cross-border privacy rules system and establish the Global Cross-Border Privacy Rules Forum. So again, thank you, Shannon, for joining us for this event, and I'll hand off the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randall. I'm going to try to share my screen. I would welcome confirmation that I am doing so successfly. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's see if I can do that. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers and my colleagues at POST for inviting me to participate in this very important discussion. As my introduction noted, I'm the Director of Global Data Policy at the International Trade Administration. So I sit at the intersection of trade and data policy. And ITA, International Trade Administration, ITA, has been in this policy space for decades, at least in my memory, going back to the 90s, and when the internet was just getting warmed up, and folks were starting to use the internet for commercial purposes. We were already engaged in this policy space internationally. Then, of course, we weren't necessarily looking at barriers or even so much regulation at that time. We were starting to come out, but we were recognizing that this was a space that was going to have significant impact, and it was one where we needed to promote trust in this, digital ecosystem. And so we've been engaged in different international fora for some time in promoting efforts to build that kind of trust. So, for example, going back to the OECD, the 1980 privacy guidelines, through the 2005 APEC privacy framework. So we have long been proponents of working with our international partners to promote both trust, data protection, but also cross-border data flows, and to promote the economic benefit of the digital economy. So I know that we've already talked a little bit about the value of data flows and the cost of data localization, and we have a number of speakers coming that will talk more specifically about that. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but just to say that the reason why this is so important to our agency, to my office, is that we know that data underpins global trade and investment. And it is so fundamental to global trade and investment that it's really hard to separate. And this is really, I think, exemplified in the October 2022 announcement from President Biden on the implementation of the privacy framework between the US and the EU, where the reference point for the value of that agreement was that it underpinned 7.1 trillion in transatlantic trade. So I think that's really a good example of really putting a value on these issues. So turning now to my presentation, I want to spend a few minutes introducing one of our priority efforts, global efforts in this space. And that is the establishment and promotion of the Global CBPR Forum. I refer back to Assistant Director Sherilyn mentioned the APEC CBPR system. And this is related, and I will get to that in a minute. But I did want to just start off by, let's see if I can switch. Here we go. By giving a quick introduction of this Global CBPR Forum. So this forum actually is a forum where we partner with the Philippines, as well as 7 other members. And we partnered with our 8 other members to establish the forum in April of 2022. And so this sort of reflects our announcement that we are agreeing to establish this forum. We established, well, first I'll say all of the members of the Global Forum are the same members that participate in the APEC CBPR system, reflected here in this list. And a primary objective of the establishment of this forum was to globalize the APEC CBPR system. Very quickly, just maybe go through this a little bit. So just as a background, the APEC CBPR system as an APEC initiative was only open to participation by an APEC member. So it was necessarily limited to a regional program. So recognizing, you know, that the CBPR program was endorsed in 2011. Between 2011 and 2022, when we established the Global Forum, regulation of data exploded. And now, we went from a few countries regulating personal data and cross-border data flows to now a vast majority of countries are doing so. And we recognize the need for a tool to engage with partners that shared both privacy values and also values of promoting trust and cross-border data flows and trade and the digital economy. So that was really the underpinning of the effort to globalize the CBPR system, is to open up. So not to be open, not restricted to any particular region. And so we established the forum in 2022. And then in the first year, we focused on building the internal structure of the forum, and also in creating membership terms and categories. So in fact, 1 year later, on our first anniversary, we were able to open the doors to have new members join. And this is important because actually shortly after we quote unquote opened the doors to membership, we actually welcomed our first member, and our first member outside of the APEC region, the United Kingdom, joined as an associate shortly after this announcement. And I should say that since the establishment of the forum in April of 2022, the forum and forum members have engaged with over 24 different jurisdictions from all regions interested in the forum and our activities. So we're very excited about the interest in this in the work that we're doing, and really becoming a global mechanism. So just very quickly, just to highlight, as I said, we did work on establishing forum, sort of it's our operations, including leadership. And, you know, I think this is a really important reflection of all of the investment from the CBPR members, including Philippines, that is chairing one of our primary committees. So just a quick note to sort of explain what is the CBPR system and how does it work. So I mentioned before sort of work in the international space in OECD and APEC to develop sort of core privacy principles, and those are listed here. And these are principles that, you know, going back to really, you know, the 1980 OECD privacy guidelines are now reflected in laws all over the world, and including the Philippines. The principles here are familiar, and these principles serve the basis for the CBPR system. So essentially, trying to so maybe we'll move on to the next slide, just very quickly to outline how does the CBPR system work. What is it? The CBPR system is a government-backed data privacy certification. So all of the participant governments agree on certification standards and agree on, you know, the whole system and of how certifications are issued. They agree on the terms of who can issue certifications, and then we all are able to participate in this certification scheme and have our companies get certified to these standards we agree. At its very core, we have agreed on what a certification is comprised of. So if a company wants to obtain a certification, they have to meet the same requirements wherever they're getting certified, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in the Philippines. We all have jointly agreed on those terms. And as a part of our becoming a member in this certification scheme, we have mapped our laws, our domestic laws, to those standards to demonstrate to all the other members how those requirements are enforceable. And what's really interesting about the approach that we developed in the CBPR system is that there's flexibility in how those standards are enforced. So laws don't have to be precisely the same. They can be different. So it allows flexibility, but it requires commonality. We all agree that these things are how you get, we agree on the results. How you get there is entirely up to the jurisdiction and your law. So it allows for the connection, for example, with the United States, where we enforce our privacy laws on the basis of consumer protection and the Federal Trade Commission, with the Philippines that has a comprehensive privacy law and a data or the data privacy regulator. So that's sort of one way that we're, I think finding that unique, scalable, multilateral, flexible type of approach that I think is quite attractive. The other element, and I know when we were talking about an earlier presentation, talking about accountability is an important element of the Philippines Mesic law. Well, this system, in fact, is based on accountability, because in order to participate, it is voluntary for companies, but in order to be certified, they have to have an independent third party in the system. They're called accountability agents. They have to have that independent third party verify that they're meeting the requirements. And then those independent third parties monitor and then otherwise annually certify these organizations. So it creates a accountability framework for companies, and that builds trust with regulators and governments and companies for each other. Sort of another element of this that I think is appealing for companies in particular is the fact that you, as a company, get certified locally, and then that local certification can be recognized in any other participating jurisdiction. So the framework is established on mutual recognition. You don't and facilitates and promotes scalability for companies. So I think that was, yeah, that's my last slide. This is really meant to be a high level introduction to this type of multilateral approach. For a long time, as I mentioned, you know, the US and Philippines and other countries have worked in different multilateral fora to develop principles of what data protection should be. But this is the first instance where those principles have actually been taken and operationalized, where we actually provide a concrete tool that companies, organizations can use to demonstrate good best practices and data protection across multiple jurisdictions. And we think that this is a promising approach of building trust in the digital ecosystem and to realize the benefits of global cross-border data flow. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shannon, for providing a good overview of developments at the multilateral level for all these policy considerations in relation to cross-border data flow. And we understand that I think it might be difficult for you to stay on until later, until our panel discussion. But if you could stay a little bit, maybe if just in case there are some questions in the Q&A, we'd really appreciate it. I think you provided us good inputs, and I'm sure some of our audience members would want to ask some questions as well. So now we'll move on to our next speaker. Naoto Kanehira is a senior specialist in the World Bank's Digital Development Global Practice based at the World Bank Philippines office in Manila. Naoto works on lending and analytical advisory engagements in the Philippines and East Asia and Pacific, covering digital connectivity, digital government, and digital economy, in particular through policy reforms and enabling environment. He has a BA from Keio University, MS from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and MPA from Harvard University, and he's worked on technology and innovation policies in Eastern Europe, South Asia, and Africa, and the World Bank strategy, budget, operations, policy, and human resources prior to his current assignment in the Philippines. So now, thank you, Naoto, for joining us today, and I'll hand off the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Randall, for kind introduction, and to the event host for inviting us, the World Bank, to be part of this timely and important policy discussion on cross-border data flows. What I will do in the 15-minute slot that was given to me are the two things. One is just quickly introduce ourselves. I want to do this because the data governance as a policy space has been increasingly important across what we do at the World Bank in this country. And then secondly, try to address a couple of specific questions that the event host asked us to address. So broadly, the World Bank has a range of engagement on the digital transformation, digital economy, and related topics in the Philippines and across the East Asia region. President Marcos has been loud and clear on digitalization as one of the top priorities of his administration, with the preceding national vision and succeeding 3 years national development plan. So our management say yes to all of this. We are here to support. We are here to make the national ambition to reality. We are here to help implement the development plan effectively and efficiently. So our country director, Ndiame Diop, who is head of the Manila office of the World Bank, say for the Philippines to maintain the high economic growth, the capital accumulation is an important parameter, and infrastructure investment is going to be a driver, including on the digital infrastructure, also to create enabling environment for private investment. Our new president, Ajay Banga, has been clear. Given his background, he's injecting a new fresh eyes on how the World Bank is helping the governments harnessing digitalization to produce various socioeconomic impact to promote development. Informed by this guidance and the demands, we have, broadly speaking, 4 lines of engagement in the Philippines. And as I said, data governance is an emerging and cross-cutting topic for all of these. The first line of service we provide to the government of Philippines is through Department of Finance, through an instrument that we call policy lending. This is a non-earmarked general budget support, conditional to implementation of the committed and agreed policy reforms between the government and the World Bank. And part of the recent policy reform programs cover topics around digital transformation, including infrastructure, finance, e-commerce, digital governance, e-governance, and the skills. This also touches on broader topics around innovation ecosystems, financial inclusion, etc., etc. The second relatively new one, which we are preparing now, is specific project investments with the ICT on extending broadband infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure deployment, especially for the rural areas, combined with strengthened cybersecurity and government cloud environment. The third is primarily around the national ID system under PSA, the program called PhilSys, on fast and effective deployment of the ID system, digitalization of ID system, and its integration to broader services. Across all of these 3, data governance, including on the cross-border data flows, are among the key determinants of the effectiveness of the broader design and implementation of the program. The 4th I listed here are not only at the country level, but at the regional level, including through ASEAN. ASEAN Secretariat recently asked for the World Bank assistance to become their development partner to inform some of these topics to inform the regional cooperation, including on cross-border data flows and interoperability of the services around national ID systems and cybersecurity. When trying to frame the cross-border data topic, cross-border data flows topic, it's important for us to take one step back and see whether domestically or internationally, why data matters when we think about development. And a few years ago, the World Bank published what is called World Development Report, dedicated to this topic. For us, when promoting the broader development objectives of middle and lower income countries at our membership, we look at 3 channels for data to flow and promote development objectives. The first channel is through citizens, civil society, and academia to improve the accountability, transparency of governance. The second channel is through the governments to improve policy making and public service delivery in an evidence-based data-driven manner. The third is primarily through private sector to increase and expand digital economic opportunities. First through digital services, but much broadly and profoundly. And the policy choice and trade-off, well, I mean, this should not be the trade-off, but the optimal balance that each and all government need to consider is among the economic value of data and the trust that citizens and governments within and across national borders can have in the cyber digital environment and equity. So with this, we say there has to be new kind of social contract that help harness the power of data to achieve multiple dimensions of development objectives. On the economic value of the cross-border data flows, I think this is already well addressed in the previous presentation side. We'll not go deep into it, but through the services trade, it's obvious that over the last 10 or 20 years, the economic importance of cross-border data flows has been expanding exponentially. But going back to the earlier point, not necessarily on economic value, but trust and equity, the 4 dimensions as key policy considerations. The top 2 are obvious on the economic value, but the bottom 2 here, what we say, there has to be the safeguard measures to address concerns about the data misuse and cybercrime and other negative potential consequences in absence of adequate safeguard measures. And also given that this policy choice around data governance and cross-border data flow is not purely economic, there are non-economic considerations as well, such as national security or law enforcement, so that the World Bank as a primarily economic development agency tends to avoid saying whether less restrictive measures are good practice or more restrictive measures are bad practice. These are all countries' choice, given our membership and different preferences, but at least the deliberation on the trade-offs and policy choices has to be transparent and consultative. And it's also worth emphasizing that the value of data is not narrowly, purely economic, but more broadly on socially and essential for the citizens' access to services in the world today when people, businesses, investment, and information flow across borders, especially in a country like the Philippines, where millions of people, or perhaps dozens of millions of people, either work and live abroad, or the households and livelihood heavily depends on economic cross-border financial and data flows. We painfully experienced it through the pandemic, either through vaccine certificates or sending remittances or any other essential public and private service provisions to the populations across national borders, certain intergovernmental alignment and services through international firms turned out to be essential. Pandemic accelerated digitalization across many countries, but also revealed the vulnerability due to inadequate interoperability across the systems, across jurisdictions. Also important to mention that even domestic and national initiatives, such as the National ID program in the Philippines, heavily rely on cross-border data flows. Essentially in the Philippines, the cloud-first policy has been an instrumental and forward-looking intervention to allow certain types of data to freely, flow across borders, so that the massive data flow between Singapore and the Philippines, essentially the underpinning of the very fast registration and pre-authentication process that took place over the last few years. We recently analyzed several East Asian countries' data governance and data protection legal systems to classify countries across three broad approaches, from open transfers to limited transfers, and there's something in between. And this is kind of aggregate and general characterization. Of course, once we dive into more granular specific, either sector-specific or country-specific characteristics, it's much deeper than this oversimplified three groups, but it's still useful to have a big picture view like this. So Philippines is one of the few countries, actually together with Singapore, in this region, which can be characterized as open transfer approach. Vietnam is the only country in the region which can be characterized with limited transfers. In Southeast Asia, China is among this peer group once we expand the geographic scope. More broadly, through the World Development Report that I mentioned earlier, we do see countries vary making their choice. So countries equivalent to the current Philippines data governance regimes include the United States, Mexico, Canada, Australia, and several others. Countries belonging to the same group as Vietnam are essentially China, Russia, and a few others. How do these impact the essentially economic implications? This is not the World Bank analysis, but our experts believe viable and credible for us to cite and present. It's from recent EU-centric analysis produced by Frontier Economics. Essentially, what this does is do the scenario simulation of what would happen if these countries choose to be data protectionists. So the two scenarios that helped model the different consequences. Scenario one is the worst case scenario, as they call it. So what it says is, what if UK, for example, decides to make it mandatory for everyone to store data locally and prohibit any kind of cross-border data transfers. And then the major, or essentially all important trade partner for the same country adopts the same measures. What happens? So that's what drives close to 9% of the reduction in trade and more than 2% reduction of the value addition, which will translate to reduction in GDP growth. And they do the second scenario, asking what if, building on the first scenario, and then still the country recover part of the loss by bilaterally agreeing with EU around the EU's determination of adequacy. So of course, its impact depends on the relative importance of EU as the trade partner for respective countries. What we see here, the 2 points I would like to highlight. One is China as an outlier in this analysis. The impact is much smaller in China in this scenario compared to other countries, primarily because China is already highly restricted. So incremental reduction following scenario one is rather limited. The second point is the implication for the countries belonging to open transfers group, which would include US and EU, US and Mexico. So essentially the highest impact which could be anticipated when countries switch to the restrictive regime naturally would be highest if the current regime is open and liberal, and Philippines belong to the same group of countries. Our general recommendations when taking these into considerations, as I said, the World Bank tend to refrain from saying good practice or bad practice based on belonging to group A, group 2, or group 3. But what's important is regulatory predictability. Surprising policy shifts through untransparent and non-consultative process would shock companies, and it would affect the economic actors' general assessment of the country risks. So countries would make their policy choices based on economic and non-economic considerations, which is very viable, especially in the current geopolitical global landscape. But when doing so, countries should maintain engagement channels and testing the market appetite across different stakeholders to make the policies and regulatory framework predictable enough. Because whichever regime countries choose, companies will cope, citizens would cope, but there has to be the engagement. A few specific items that I list here, not necessarily to say that these measures are recommended specifically in the Philippines context right now. Some of these are already mentioned on the regional framework. But the process around formulating policies, coordinating with regional peers, engaging the private and other sectors would be very important. And second set of recommendations is also to say more about the process, not only domestically, but also internationally. As also mentioned by our DTI colleague upfront, trade negotiation is one of the primary channels for this global and regional coordination. There are a lot of bilateral, plurilateral forums, and there's multilateral alignment and dialogue channels beyond WTO and trade-related agreements. And there's a need for stronger technical and institutional engagement capacities to conduct these processes meaningfully. And the World Bank is also happy to say, and we work closely with OECD and G20 and other forums to aim for collective, productive, conducive outcomes through the evolving process. So I will end my presentation here. Thank you very much again, and looking forward to the further discussions.
Thank you. Thank you, Naoto, for your comprehensive presentation, the World Bank's involvement on this issue. And I think it's important that you highlighted the potential economic impact of any restrictive policy shifts, and also that you highlighted the need for a transparent and consultative process on any policy shifts on this issue. Before we move on to our next speaker, again, we encourage everyone to use the Q&A function, but also we encourage everyone to also, if possible, to identify yourselves in the Q&A. We know there's an option to ask it anonymously, but we'd also like to acknowledge those who are asking questions later on if possible. So there. So now we move on to our next speaker. Janos Ferencs is a trade policy analyst at the Trade Policy Division of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He leads the organization's work on monitoring policy and regulatory trends affecting global services trade and contributes to work on digital trade, focusing on lowering trade barriers for digitally enabled services, regulations on cross-border data flows and data localization, and the trade implications of new technologies such as artificial intelligence. So thank you, Janos, for joining us, I know from a different time zone as well. So I'll hand off the floor to you.
Thank you, Randall. Thank you for the kind introduction, and good morning to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting the OECD to this very important discussion. I think we heard a lot today already about the importance of digital transformation and new technologies and how it affects the global economy. And much of this transformation is underpinned by data. And the flow of information is a bit like an invisible gateway that connects people, makes us be able to work remotely, to trade across borders, and it proved very important to enhance global resilience in time of the pandemic. But much of this, I think, is also linked to not having any obstacles to the movement of information and data across the globe, and any obstacle or any barrier, including data localization measures, could substantially inhibit the benefit that we extract from this globalized environment. So what I would like to do in my presentation is to present you some recent findings that we have done at the OECD together with my colleagues Javier Lopez Gonzalez and Chiara Del Giovane in a paper that's coming out very soon, where we looked at the nature, evolution, and potential implications of data localization measures. Let me start maybe with the basics and what is data localization. There is no single agreed definition of what data localization is. There are, broadly speaking, two different buckets or two different categories where we can place data localization measures. One is an explicit requirement or direct measures where we see direct legislation or a regulatory requirement mandating that certain types of data be stored within the country, within the jurisdiction. There's the second group, which is more of an implicit or indirect set of data localizations, where typically data localization is a consequence of another measure. For instance, if you require companies to establish locally in order for them to be able to operate, indirectly those companies will also need to set up their data centers locally in order to fulfill that localization requirement. So we started off with these two broad approaches to data localization, but in our paper, we decided to focus more on the explicit direct measures because those are much more objective and easier to identify in the legislative instruments. If you look at the different type of data localization measures, broadly speaking, we can distinguish between three main groups. And these reflect the fact that data localization requirements are often also paired with different types of processing or flow restrictions. And the first category refers to measures where there is a local storage requirement, but there is no prohibition on the flow of information outside of the country. This is what we call category 1. These measures are often applied in order to allow regulators to have jurisdictional reach in case there is a need for them to access information. And for instance, it applies to information such as accounting information, telecommunications, or financial data. The second category is a little bit different in that it requires data to be stored locally and allows international access or transfer on the basis of clearly defined conditions. An example of this approach is the Electronic Health Records Act in Australia, which requires that health information be stored in Australia, but access from outside is possible if there are certain conditions met by the users or by registered healthcare providers. The third category is perhaps the most restrictive one, where not only there is a requirement to store data locally, also any type of information flow outside of the country is prohibited. This is what we call category 3. An example of this is China's cybersecurity law, where, for instance, Article 37 of this law mandates that critical information infrastructure operators must store all important data in China. Now, you also notice that there is a category 0 on the screen, which is something that started to appear relatively recently, where there is no particular requirement for data to be stored locally, but firms are required to ensure that there is access to the data at all times should the regulator require to have that. For our paper, we have done an inventory of data localization measures, and up until early this year, we have identified close to 100 measures across 40 countries. And actually, if you look at the evolution of this over time, you see that about half of these measures have started to come in force after 2015. So there has been a boom in terms of the number of new data localization measures being imposed. And actually about 2/3 of these measures today are this category 3 type of measures, meaning that they are the most restrictive measure whereby not only storage is required, but also any flow outside of the country is prohibited. There is, of course, a different nuance depending on which sector or which type of data you're looking into. And about 1/3 of the data localization measures that we identified apply on a cross-cutting basis, which means that they apply to all economic activities. And this is very important because it means that they have implications across the entire economy. And particularly if you think about any activity, any business would be affected by such type of localization measures. But in addition to these cross-cutting measures, there's also a high percentage of financial, banking, and payments related localization requirements. Also in the public sector and telecommunications sector, we see a relatively big share of these measures. With regard to the specific types of data, most localization measures affect basically 5 categories of data: personal data, business records, financial data, public sector data, and telecoms data. So together, these are the core areas where most of the localization measures occur. Identifying the economic and societal impact of data localization is not an easy task, mostly because it's very difficult to clearly measure the costs and benefits that are related to these measures. And given such empirical limitations, it's very important to consult with businesses who are more affected by these measures. And for the purposes of our paper, we have actually carried out 2 different exercises. The first one was to leverage a joint business survey that we have conducted together with the World Trade Organization, whereby we gathered responses from 85 different companies across the globe. And the second exercise was to develop case studies, whereby we would be looking at specific implications of data localization measures for e-payments, cloud computing, and air travel. So let me share with you some of the insights from the business questionnaire first. The questionnaire asked businesses to provide insights on the potential costs that are associated with data localization measures, and we have asked them to think about costs that affect category 1 measures, so more simple type of data localization measures, and the more restrictive category 3 type of measures. The responses indicate that even this more simpler data localization measure, this category 1 measure, would entail fairly significant costs in data management, going up until 16%. But really, the category 3 type of measures would be the most harmful in terms of data management costs, going up to 55%. And actually, 8% of the respondents said that these more prohibitive data localization measures would inhibit their activity altogether. To note also that there is a fair amount of respondents who were unsure about the potential costs, which is, I think, also an important finding in terms of understanding the potential costs of data localization measures. We also asked businesses about the extent to which data localization measures have helped deliver on specific legitimate public policy objectives, which are very often used as reasons to impose data localization measures. And as you can see from the outcomes, around 70% of the respondents either did not think or were not sure about the links between data localization and objectives such as innovation, privacy protection, or data security. So going a bit into the case studies, the first one was on cross-border e-payments. And we used these 3 case studies basically because we selected them because these are sectors where we see a very important influence and reliance on data as a core business model. So it was a very good exercise for us to understand the potential implications of what does it mean to have data localization measures. For e-payments, this is an interesting case study whereby you have a lot of different actors involved, from the merchant who tries to sell a good or a service, the merchant's bank, the buyer, the buyer's bank, and credit and payment providers somewhere in between, which make sure that the transactions are connected and secure along the way. So one important finding for us was that after this cross-cutting category that I showed you before, the e-payment sector is the one that is mostly affected by data localization measures, about 16% of those identified. And most of these are actually the most restrictive form of localization measure, this category 3 type of approach. Businesses also told us that data localization significantly affects the ability of firms to operate across international networks, and particularly it has the implication of fragmenting markets, and particularly smaller markets would tend to lose from data localization measures, given that there would be higher costs for the firms to enact the necessary facilities and security around data in these smaller markets. There are also vulnerabilities when it comes to fraud and cybersecurity, particularly because there would be more limited amount of information that can be shared across the networks, and this also reduces resilience overall. The second case study was on cloud computing, and this is also a very interesting case study because the entire business model is built on the ability to shuttle information across the borders, and it's very much built on being able to access servers that are outside the country or the jurisdiction where the consumer is. What we found in terms of the data localization measures was that there's an increasing amount of data localization that targets specifically cloud computing. We have identified 7 so far, and there were some that were still in the draft phase. Most of these are also category 3 measures, which means they're most restrictive. In terms of implications, businesses told us that data localization measures, similarly to e-payments, they lead to higher costs and reduced services offerings, which again has to do with the fact that market fragmentation across borders tends to undermine the scope of services that can be provided to consumers. And this affects particularly those that might be consumers in a smaller market. Again, there was also an important mention of cybersecurity risks, which tend to be higher when there is data localization measures in place and not being able to share potential threat data or potential information on vulnerabilities across networks. And the last case was in air travel. Here, again, this is a sector that is highly data intensive, and it's also heavily regulated through bilateral agreements and international bodies such as the International Civil Aviation Organization or the International Air Transport Association. And a lot of the information that is already in place makes sure that data transfers take place fairly efficiently at the moment, but there has been a growing concern about data localization measures that affect, for instance, the ability to pay for your air tickets. So when it comes to outsourcing the payments to a third-party provider that is subject to localization measures that might break the transaction. And there's also a growing concern about the interlinkages between data protection, data privacy regulations, and how they affect the ability of airlines to operate across borders. So it was a very interesting case study for us to look into it. And to conclude, what potential actions can we do going forward? One important action is to continue monitoring this evolving regulatory environment. There's a lot happening, and there are a lot of different regulatory measures that are currently being discussed. So it becomes very important to continue to keep an eye on these developments as we go forward. There's also important to think about, from a policy perspective, what are the different forms of data localization measures, and how can we ensure that different policy priorities are met using the least restrictive forms of data measures. So as I mentioned, there are different kinds of categories, but not all are equally restrictive. So maybe there is scope to achieve the objectives that governments want using a least restrictive way on data flows. There's also a need for continued cooperation, both across governments, but involving a broader set of stakeholders, including businesses. And there is also a need to continue these discussions and coordinations on a global level, so including through what we heard on the global CBPR initiatives in regional trade agreements at the WTO, of course, and through regional initiatives, including at APEC. So thank you very much. I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Janusz, for that very good presentation. I think it's good that you highlighted potential actions moving forward on this, and it's also, I think, important that you highlighted the specific and practical implications for sectors. In particular, I think for me, it was of interest that you highlighted air travel, because it would not have been the first thought for me and the sectors that would have been affected by this, but I think it just really highlights how wide-reaching any potential restriction on data flow would have on various sectors. So thank you. And look forward to your participation later at the Q&A. So now I'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Jared Ragland. He serves as a Senior Director for Policy APAC at BSA, the Software Alliance. Working with BSA members, he develops BSA's international strategies, open markets, and promote innovation and digital trade in important foreign markets in the Asia-Pacific region. Before joining BSA, he served as the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office Intellectual Property Rights Attaché in the Shanghai Consulate General. He served as a director in the Office of International Intellectual Property and Innovation in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And he's also served as the Science Policy Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to APEC in the State Department's Office of Economic Policy and the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He received a doctorate in molecular and cellular biology from the University of Washington, a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry, and a Bachelor of Arts with a double major in East Asian Studies and Anthropology from the University of Arizona. Thank you, Dr. Ragland, for joining us, and I hand off the floor to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all the supporters and organizers who've created this opportunity and this important event, and for inviting me to participate. So I'm going to see if I can share my slides here. Get this to come up. All right, where are they? Okay, here we go. So I hope that you can see these properly. So what I wanted to do, or what I was asked to do, is talk about how international data transfers can enhance cybersecurity. So before I dive into this topic, many of the issues of which have been already touched upon, I wanted to introduce the organizations that I'm representing today. So I'm coming to you in my capacity as a representative of the Global Data Alliance, but to understand the Global Data Alliance, I need to introduce BSA, the Software Alliance. So BSA is the leading advocate for the global enterprise software industry around the world. We are a global organization with headquarters in Washington, but with operations and offices around the world, including in North and South America, Europe, and here in the Asia Pacific. So I head up the Asia Pacific policy operations for BSA based out of Singapore, but we have offices in Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing, New Delhi, and so on and so forth. So that's BSA, enterprise software. Here are some of our members, just to give you a sense of who we represent, essentially focused on companies that provide IT services to other organizations, enterprises, government agencies, academic institutions, so on and so forth. Less focused on the consumer-facing side of the IT industry. The Global Data Alliance is an organization that we set up a few years ago to talk about cross-border data transfer issues and data localization requirements on a cross-industry basis. So we're a cross-industry coalition of companies that are committed to high standards of data responsibility and that all rely on the transfers of data around the world to innovate and create jobs. So the insight here is that a lot of times when you're talking about these issues, people think of data transfers and data localization requirements as primarily impacting certain sectors. But the insight we're trying to bring with the Global Data Alliance is that cross-border data transfers, restrictions, and data localization requirements really affect all sectors in all industries and can have a pretty detrimental impact on economic development, especially if not designed in a very careful manner. So here are some of the GDA members. We're still growing, but again, a lot of companies that rely on data transfers but may not be thought of as traditional technology or IT industry companies. So I'm going to click through the next couple slides fairly quickly because most of this has already been stated. But this slide is just to emphasize that, of course, data transfers are manifold. Any communication from a person or a device from one place to another is a data transfer. Financial transactions, you need to transfer data for product safety approvals. We'll get to this a little bit more specifically since we were focusing a little bit more on cybersecurity, but data transfers are critical for transmitting information that allows companies to protect consumers from fraud, ID theft, malicious cyber attacks. They're important for IP protection and for tracking either intellectual property infringing or just plain out dangerous counterfeit products, helps law enforcement and other companies to identify distribution patterns. And of course, data is increasingly important in terms of optimizing supply chains to reach a sustainable and carbon neutral objectives that so many of us have. So, and again, there are many more. This is what I call the big numbers slide. I can't even imagine what quintillion bits of data are, but the key here is that 60% of the global GDP is digitized. We're looking at billions of people and a couple times that many connected devices within the next year or two. 75% of the value of data transfers accrues to traditional industries in places like agriculture, logistics, and manufacturing. So again, this is not just a technology industry interest. It's a challenge that affects every sector in every country all over the world. We've heard a lot about the boom in data transfer restrictive policies, which is certainly a concern. But maybe on the good news, we also have a lot of increased interest in negotiations to help address the challenges that arise from some of these data transfer restrictions. So many countries that are members of the WTO already have commitments that impact on their cross-border data transfer policies. And as our colleague from the Philippines Department of Trade and Industry discussed earlier, there are a variety of other negotiations ongoing to try to address those issues. Somebody mentioned earlier that I think it was the World Bank showed some slides discussing the rise or the sort of status of data transfer policies. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly stop this presentation and I'm going to open up just a quick shot of this document, which, wait, yeah, sharing this one. Okay, here we go. So BSA, or the Global Data Alliance, also created a recent cross-border data policy index, and I just wanted to show that we had a very similar outcome in terms of data restrictive policies, with these countries in red being the most severe, those in purple having highly restrictive data policies, but not quite as bad as the countries in red. We have the sort of European Union bloc at level 2, and then we have a number of countries. Notice our assessment of Philippines, distinct from a couple of the other ASEAN countries that we looked at as being relatively open. So just wanted to sort of note that we're converging in terms of the academic research, if you will, on a kind of an assessment. But of course, this is just a snapshot in time, and we will be seeing changes one way or another on these policies going forward. So back to my originally scheduled slides. So I hope this is coming up properly for everybody. So here we are. Another sort of piece of data to set the table before I dive into some of the cybersecurity specific related issues that I wanted to talk about. If you look at this pie chart, the vast majority of global data transfers are within the APAC region. And so the fact that you've got a number of countries in this region that are increasing data transfer restrictive policies and data localization requirements is quite concerning, given all the stuff that was already said about the importance of data transfers for the global GDP and for the support on all of these different sectors. Clearly, data transfers are underpinning an enormous amount of economic activity in our region in particular. And this, I think, is the last one that just kind of telling everybody what they probably already know. But again, if you look at sort of data transfers in the context of a value chain, they are critical for every single step of the way, from the initial R&D to marketing, safety and productivity requirements, so on and so forth, right on to post-sale services. So all that's to say, data transfer restrictions and data localization requirements can have a pretty profound impact across a large range of sectors, arguing strenuously that data transfer restrictive policies and data localization requirements should be undertaken with the utmost of care and really thought through, including their costs before implemented. So let's see here. Looks like I might be sharing my presentation screen. So let me see if I can get this there. Maybe this one's better. Okay. Yeah. So cross-border data transfers specific to cybersecurity, these are critical in the sector for a variety of reasons. First of all, companies and other organizations utilize data transfers to monitor data traffic patterns, identify anomalies, and divert potential threats using real-time data. Companies also store data in geographically diverse regions to obscure data obscure data location information to reduce physical threats, improve latency, maintain redundancy, increase resilience, and ensure continuity of operations. You know, cybersecurity is, I kind of think of cybersecurity on sort of three tiers, if you will. You've got sort of broader cybersecurity capabilities amongst companies kind of across the sector. We're all struggling with the lack of resources and manpower in this space, and most companies still don't invest enough in cybersecurity capabilities. So anything that increases the cost or reduces the effectiveness of cybersecurity in the marketplace is going to have some pretty powerful impacts. Moving up the sort of sensitivity chain, if you will, you go into critical infrastructure protection. This is usually more highly regulated in various countries, including many in this region. And again, there's a tendency, as has been discussed earlier, to consider data localization requirements or restrictions on data transfers for quote unquote security reasons in this context. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's often misguided. And then kind of the highest level is around public, highly sensitive classified public sector data, which again, many countries kind of understandably, if not justifiably, will tend to want to keep that data very close to home, if you will. But I think the key thing that folks want to think about is, what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to achieve data security, and data security is primarily determined not by where data happens to reside, but more about what kinds of standards and controls are the entities that are controlling that data are subjecting that data to. There are perhaps a few circumstances in which data localization increases the ability of governments to force certain kinds of access to data, but those are far and few in between. And for the most part, what you want, whether it's highly sensitive government data, critical infrastructure protection, or just general cybersecurity capabilities, what you want is to make sure that that data is being controlled by trusted entities with the highest standards of cybersecurity controls and policies and procedures. So let's see here. So some of the risks from data transfer restrictions, just to dive into a little bit, some of the risks from data transfer restrictions and data localization requirements for the capability of achieving cybersecurity is that these restrictions will often impede integrated cybersecurity planning within an organization. And again, I'm using organization quite broadly. It could be a public sector agency, could be a retailer, and anything in between. So data transfer restrictions force organizations to adopt a siloed approach to data. This often restricts the locus of certain data, but not others. That adds complexity to the system, and adding unnecessary technical complexity without any corresponding security benefits basically artificially increases the costs and the risks associated with protecting that data in the first place. I already mentioned this, but data transfer restrictions can severely impede the visibility of cybersecurity risks. That the bad actors in the world, whether they're state-backed or organized criminals or just hackers for fun, they're not really following local laws on jurisdictional restrictions and things of that sort. And so if the defenders cannot access real-time threat indicators from other parts of the world by accessing data in real time through cross-border data transfers, it's simply going to become harder to address these efforts to undermine cybersecurity, and it provides a structural advantage to the entities that are conducting these attacks in the first place. All right. A few others, again, a lot of companies, even in the IT space, will use other organizations to amplify their own cybersecurity risk management through third-party cybersecurity service providers. Many of the best in class are multinational companies that provide services internationally and globally. And so any data transfer restrictions that make it difficult for those services to be available in one's market are simply reducing the availability of the best solutions out there to a country's own entities and citizens. The misconception that keeping data within national boundaries will, by definition, increase security is very risky, because it prevents efficient geographical distribution and dispersion of data, which can help in terms of backup and redundancies, whether the risks are natural disasters or whether they're more intentional acts by bad actors. So we've got plenty of examples in the world these days where, in fact, in times of crisis, what you want is your data to be not residing locally, but accessible and backed up in geographically dispersed locations. And finally, we've touched on this, but data transfer restrictions and data localization requirements will impede the availability of competitive, globally available products and services in your market. And so one of the concerns we face is that many of the security or privacy or other sort of what I would consider legitimate policy interests that drive governments to consider data localization restriction requirements or data transfer restrictions, those can be addressed through conversations with the industry to find solutions that meet those objectives without unnecessarily impacting the ability to offer those services in the market and to make sure that they don't unintentionally actually undermine those services. Those objectives, privacy, cybersecurity, so on and so forth. But if the policies are designed to create barriers to competition, well, then it's a harder conversation to have because the government objective in that case is simply at odds with the commercial and the policy interests of the companies who want to offer services to enhance personal information protection, cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. So I think to sort of sum things up, what countries need to be doing, and we think that the Philippines is generally looking at it in this way, is we want to promote international data transfers, both domestically and internationally through negotiations. And we want to encourage an approach that doesn't take a sort of a knee-jerk, prescriptive and compliance-oriented approach that involves data transfer restrictions and data localization requirements, but instead we want to encourage true risk-based protections that create a conducive environment for innovation and competition and improve cybersecurity by allowing all kinds of organizations to select the technologies that best meet their needs. This will also help upskill the cybersecurity skill capabilities in markets if the approach taken is one that drives more organizational accountability and risk-based thinking in organizations across the board, whether it's public sector or private, as opposed to a more checklist-oriented approach to cybersecurity and compliance. So hopefully y'all have access to these slides afterwards. Otherwise, here's your chance to take a quick snapshot of some URLs that draw some of the information that I used to build this presentation. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Here's some contact information for me going forward, and I look forward to the further discussions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jared, for your presentation. It was good that you also highlighted that there are some positive developments in regards to the increasing interest in negotiations around this issue. And also, I think you made a very important point on cybersecurity, that actually data restrictions, as opposed to data being open, having open policies on data, will actually have a potentially negative impact on cybersecurity. I think it's important once you go into consultations and discussions on the policy considerations and any potential regulation. So we look forward to your participation later in the discussion. So now I'll move on to the next segment of our program on some industry presentations in relation to the issue. So to start, I'd like to call on a representative from the IT BPM sector, Attorney Princess Ascalon. She is the Government and Regulatory Affairs Executive for IBM in the Philippines, specifically focused on the areas of information technology policy, industry investment and development, innovation, workforce, flexibility, and services trade liberalization. She also concurrently holds the role of data privacy policy leader for IBM in Asia Pacific. Previously, she was country counsel for IBM Philippines. And also, she currently serves as co-chair of the Intellectual Property Rights Committee of the American Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, the Philippine Committee co-chair of the US-ASEAN Business Council, and sits on the advisory board of the Joint Cybersecurity Working Group. So thank you, Attorney Princess, for joining us, and I'll hand off the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall, for the kind introduction. And good morning to everyone. And thank you to the organizers for this important event on discussion of data flows. Let me just share my screen. Let me just hold on. There I go. Randall, can you see the screen?
Not right now, Attorney Princess.
All right,
Still
sorry,
your video.
hold on. Okay, what about now?
There, yeah, we see it now.
Okay, right. So I'm here today on behalf of the IT Business Process Management Association of the Philippines. Sending their regards are Jack Madrid, the President and CEO of IBPAP, and Celesta Ilagan, the Chief Policy and Regulatory Affairs of IBPAP. They were originally scheduled to present this morning, but due to an emergency meeting, they asked me to present on behalf of the industry. So we've heard, the points of view of our colleagues from the industry associations about the negative impact of data localization policies on the economy at large. Just wanted to share, the perspective from the IT BPM industry specifically, the impact of data localization, not just on the industry, but to the economy itself, to the Philippine economy itself, given the contributions of the IT BPM industry to the Philippine economy. So yeah, so just to give you some idea for those who are not familiar, the IT BPM industry in the Philippines is one of the largest employers in the Philippines, if not the largest. As of 2022, there's 1.6 million direct employees in the Philippines. And the contributions to the Philippine GDP is also among one of the highest, actually, I think next only to the OFW contributions at $32.5 billion revenues generated in 2022. We also have 18% of the global IT BPM market share. And actually, I think the Philippines is one of the largest BPO destinations in Asia, just next to India. We are rated consistently as the #1 in customer services, healthcare services, and among the general in-house councils or the shared services, of the big multinationals globally. Just to give you an idea, most of the IT BPM services here serves largely the North American geography, followed by the Europeans and then the rest of APAC. We have been growing, aside from the traditional service providers catering to clients, the global in-house centers here or the shared services have actually been growing in the past 5 years. And now it's up to 25% of the scope of the IT BPM industries in the country. And, from the traditional call centers or voice services offered in the past, the IT BPM industry in the Philippines now serves a variety of industries from banking, finance, services, tech, media, and telco, healthcare, and a lot more others. So again, just to show you the scope of the services that we have been offering in the Philippines, it's now really beyond voice. We've ventured into higher value services in animation, in game development, in healthcare, and even in IT and software development. And these are, will continue to keep growing in the coming years. So again, to show the contribution of the IT BPM industry to the Philippine economy, I don't have to say the numbers, but it's a significant contributor to the Philippine GDP. And again, our share in the global IT BPM market is growing year on year. We're actually growing faster in the Philippines compared to globally IT BPM industry. So in 2023, according to the roadmap that IBPAP released just last year, in 2023 we expect to grow the headcount by 1 million from 1.6 in 2022 to 1.7 in 2023, and again grow the revenue to almost $1 billion again this year. Again, the outlook of the locators here is very highly optimistic. As you can see, 51% are optimistic that it will continue to grow in the Philippines. And again, you can see some of the growth drivers of the industry. The Philippines has one of the lowest costs in terms of IT BPM services. We have a very flexible working arrangement allowed by the government here. The work from home arrangement is growing, and we have been supported by the government in that move. Again, so just quickly showing the vision, it's really continued to grow, but not only grow, but transform really into higher value added services, adding more to those services that I showed earlier, and really creating impact to the society. And just to go into the heart of the matter, in terms of the acceleration levers that we've identified to help the industry grow. I'm not going to go into the details of this, because I think what's important in the context of our discussion is really the policy and regulatory support that we expect from the government, and of course infrastructure expansion. So just very quickly going to the heart of the matter, right? The IT BPM industry, needless to say, is heavily reliant on data and cross-border data flows. As you can see from the high value-added services that we've been rendering for the past 5 years, those are heavily reliant on data, and not just on Philippine data, but again, cross-border flows of data, given that most of the data we handle really come from our clients offshore around the world. And in line with the growth of the industry, there's really a transition to move to more advanced digital technologies, including AI, and of course a migration to cloud infrastructure services. Again, because this allows us more flexibility in terms of where to store the data, in terms of redundancies and backups, and of course reduce costs, again given the economies of scale, leveraging on data centers that we have around the world. Again, there's an increasing trend for cybersecurity, increasing cybersecurity posture and data security policies, in line with the trend again from working from home and remote working. So again, the last trend, as you see, is a shift to the hybrid working arrangements and reduced reliance on large brick and mortar offices. So the impact of data localization, I won't go into the details as this has been discussed before by the presenters, but specifically for the IT BPM industry, one of the biggest impact will be cost of services. Any data localization policies will mean more compliance. Again, my colleagues earlier have discussed, some data localization policies may take the form of, asking for permission, for example, for government to transfer data across borders, which again will become a regulatory burden to the companies. And this cost of services will just be passed on again to the customers, to the clients. And so again, cost of services increase, risk of and compliance burden, as I said, risk to cybersecurity, as Jared shared earlier. We will be, the ability to share threat data across borders will be reduced, and thus affect the cybersecurity posture of our clients. As I said, disaster recovery and redundancy, we rely really on storing data in several locations around the world, not just for cost efficiency, but really to serve as a disaster recovery or backup in case of outages, cyber attacks, and other human disasters. Lastly, global deals will need to be reviewed and restructured. So, for example, at the moment, clients, because of the pandemic and the shift to the hybrid working arrangement, most clients require a hybrid working arrangement, relying on employees working from home to ensure round-the-clock services and uninterrupted services. And all of these will be renewed and reviewed and restructured again if there will be a data localization policy in the country. And I think it not here, but and I think someone asked in the chat which jurisdictions have eased data localization requirements. And I note that most recently, Indonesia and India have both passed privacy laws, which allow for cross-border data flows in some instances. They still have some localization rules, but they're starting to veer away from the strict localization rules that they have in the past. And India is one of our biggest competitors in the BPM industry. And Javid showed a map earlier of Latin America, which is mostly green again, with open policies on cross-border data flows. Latin America is one of the Philippines' biggest competitors again in the IT BPM industry. And so, this will really be a disservice to the IT BPM industry and to the Philippine economy if the Philippines goes against this trend of opening up, and start to impose restrictions on cross-border data flows. We have actually been a beacon of light, I guess, in having this open policy across borders, and which have really been attractive to the IT BPM locators here. And so it will really be a shame if we move backwards instead of moving forward. So you've heard that data is not only the future, data is here, and the IT BPM industry is going to be more heavily reliant on data increasingly as we continue to grow. And we hope that we have the government support, the industry support to keep our policies open and really conducive to the growth of the IT BPM industry. Thank you, Randall. I think that's it.
Thank you, Attorney Princess. Thank you again for being here. It was very important that the IT BPM sector is represented in this event, given the importance of data and data flow for your sector. And I think it's important also that you stressed how important it is that the Philippines maintains its enabling policies for the growth of the sector. So thank you. So now we move on to our next speaker, Benjamin Wong, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Kenobi, which is a startup that simplifies operations of higher educational institutions and improves their capacity to prepare students for success. And he's also had experience in a multifamily office, private equity, consulting, legal, and entrepreneurship across diverse industries in Asia. So thank you, Benjamin, for being here, and I'll hand off the floor to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Randall. Hi, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kenobi. I'm just going to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it. And from there, I think we'll just share some slides. Yeah.
We're just waiting for it to... Oh, there. We can see your slide now.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Yeah, so I am actually a member company of the DPA, which is the Digital Prosperity for Asia. So we are a coalition where we think about what it means for the digital economy here in Asia. And we are actually a collective of startups and SMEs that have come together because for our part, we always think about what's really about the future for us. Because in a world where, let's say, if data transfers or if data localization becomes true, it becomes something onerous for us as startups and SMEs to thrive, especially so when we actually do this across borders and across countries. So I'll just give a very short presentation about what DPA does and what I do at DPA. And perhaps in the Q&A session itself, happy to take questions that you all might have, and also a bit more about my perspective of what I've actually done and the challenges that I face as well as a startup and SME. So about DPA, who we are is that we are an organization that consists of a growing group of innovative Asian digital companies, and we want to promote the democratization of digital technologies across all sectors. And what we want to do is really to support national governments and policymakers, especially with very concrete examples of how what we face in our roles as we actually do cross-border business. And in this, what are the issues that we face, and perhaps, you know, how governments can actually look at it to support businesses as well. Currently, we have around 40 plus members across several countries. So we have 8 countries right here. So Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, South Korea, Thailand, Japan, as well as Taiwan. And it really is a group of companies that we are not really big. We are pretty like less than 30 million in revenue. But what we actually do is that most of us do a lot of cross-border business. And it is extremely important for us that this digital economy thing is aligned, because if not, SMEs actually make 70% of the market in a lot of countries. And if we are affected, a lot of it will be affected as well. So we have launched in several places. So this is the Vietnam chapter that we launched recently in 5th of July. And we had the support of the government in Vietnam. So we launched it together with National Agency of Technology, Entrepreneurship and Commercialization Development, called NATEC, under the Ministry of Science and Technology, called MOST. And we actually got a sizable number of Vietnamese digital SMEs, because Vietnam itself is a really growing market. A lot of people hire developers from there. And the cross-border data flow is extremely important in order for Vietnam to thrive. And we actually signed an MOU with their implementation arm, which is OITI, Open Innovation and Technopreneur Institute. We also launched the other chapters. So for example, we started mainly in Singapore, 2022 September, and then went to India and Bangalore in November that year, and Korea in October, Indonesia in April 2023, and Thailand in May 2023. So you can see some pictures on the right side. These are pictures that we have taken, and we have engaged with the governments, mainly on a very grassroots level. What we actually present is really a collective voice from the startups and SMEs, that these are the things that we're actually facing on the ground. These are the things that could impact our revenues, impact our cost. And these are the very realistic things that perhaps, you know, on a very practical level, government should be actually looking at. We also did other events where we actually spoke in IPEF, the trade negotiation round in Singapore. And there were trade negotiators and representatives from the IPEF member states like Singapore, Japan, Philippines, Australia, and United States. And I myself was present there with another member company called Accredify, where we actually talk about how digital trade could play in mitigating barriers to entry for SMEs seeking to expand in the APAC region. We also did an outreach event in Taiwan on 3rd of July, where we had some representatives talk about the objectives to 15 Taiwanese digital startups. And this has really created a really good word of mouth and laid a foundation where we would do a subsequent launch event later this year. We also participated in several other things. For example, as part of the Startup 20 Engagement Forum of the G20 presidency, we supported Savishkar India and National Stock Exchange on a conference that's titled Blockchain Revolution, Unlocking Startup Opportunities in India. So in this, we actually helped to really showcase what the member companies in India and Indonesia are actually thinking. This is especially important because it's one thing to really talk about, like, let's say, the policy level, but it's another thing to really talk about the impact of policy upon SMEs that make 70% of the market. We also create several other reports. So one of the reports that we create, and we commission a report that analyzes the digital economy impact in 11 Asia Pacific countries. So just 2 key highlights. The first one is mainly that the APEC 11 has the potential to capture over 2.2 trillion in additional economic benefits beyond business as usual in 2030. The second is that the significant benefits of this is to focus on 4 enablers: policy, competition, capability, and infrastructure. So what we do is that we actually host several events and get-togethers amongst the various startups and SMEs in Asia to think about how we can actually create value locally. Although we operate on a very international front, most of us, we have a headquarters, and the headquarters is usually to the country or the nationality that we come from. And that is important because there's unity and diversity within this culture, but also because we all speak one language, one voice, and that enables us to really share the concerns across Asia Pacific itself. We also advocate a few policy pillars, for example, digital trust, emerging technologies like AI, fair procurement, which is increasingly important because we see that this is something which in Asia, it's something that, let's say it's a big company might not be able to participate in something because they don't have the local knowledge or digital trade itself. Yeah, so thank you for listening to this presentation, and hopefully I can answer more questions along the way during the Q&A itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you for giving a background of your coalition, and also I guess, for stressing the importance of involving the SME sector and any policy discussions and in various policy issues in the digital space. I'd just like to note also that I think based on your presentation right now, there's no Philippine chapter for the coalition, but hopefully in the future with greater development of the startup sector, given the enabling environment, we hope to see a chapter also from the Philippines there. So thank you. So now let me move on to our next and last speaker from the financial services sector. Rakesh Verma is the head of India Public Policy and Government Relations for Stripe India. He has over 18 years of experience in the areas of digital payments, financial services, and financial inclusion with companies such as Visa, KPMG, the National Payments Corporation of India, HDFC Bank, ICICI Bank, and Adani Enterprises. And he has worked on, through his experience, he's worked on building some of the population scale payment systems of national importance in India, which have brought positive impact in the lives of larger communities in the country. So with that, thank you, Rakesh, for joining us, and I hand off the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rendell, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to this discussion. And good morning, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Let me know once it is visible to you. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So maybe I think this is a good opportunity for me to talk about how the data localization requirements have been impacting the financial services or the digital payments sector specifically. And while my fellow panelists and speakers have already spoken a lot about how data localization and cross-border data flow restrictions, etc., have impacted various sectors. But in the next few minutes, I'll try to sort of share my experience of how the data localization measures have impacted the financial services sector. And because of the fact that in 2018, the Reserve Bank of India brought out the data localization regulations for the financial services and the payments industry in India. So I sort of share my experiences of how it went, what all sort of challenges we faced, etc. Just give me a moment. Yeah. So yeah. So broadly speaking, I think when we look at the data localization from a digital payments sector or a financial services sector point of view, I think we can broadly divide it into, let's say, 5 or 6 different states in terms of the different approaches which the countries or the markets have been taking in the data localization. So first, we all know that every company or every company would like to have a storage and processing of data which is allowed anywhere globally, and which is a sort of an ideal state for all of us. That is what we want, that we should be able to store and process data anywhere we want. So that's an ideal state, but especially in the financial services sector, we have seen different, let's say, forms and shapes of data localization. One of the approaches which we have seen is that the many regulators and governments mandate a copy of the data to be stored locally in that particular country, while they still allow to process and store the data in your global data centers, etc. The other approach which we have seen is that few regulators and few countries allow storage of data only locally. So that means that the data relating to the financial services or the payment transactions, etc., has to be stored locally within that country, while they still allow the processing of data to happen outside of the country. A typical example of this is India. So in India, while the processing of data is permitted to be done in global data centers, but at the end of the day, the data pertaining to those payment transactions, etc., has to be stored only in India. The other form of localization which we have seen, and which is just the reverse of what India has done, is that many countries and regulators ask the companies to process the data only locally within that country. However, they allow to store the data elsewhere. One of the examples which we have seen, or one country which has gone down this path, is Indonesia. So they allow processing, so they mandate the processing of data locally, but they allow the storage of the data elsewhere. Then there are certain, there are more harder restrictions. Some of the countries have adopted harder restrictions, and which mandate local only storage and processing of data, which means that you need to store and you need to process the data only in the local servers or local data centers, which are based out of that country only. And I think we have examples like China and Russia, which have gone down this path. And then there is another category of countries which have like sort of, which have mandated conditional restrictions on the cross-border flow of data, which is something like the transfer of data outside the country is only permitted if certain conditions are met by the transferee and the recipient countries. So based on certain conditional obligations, etc., once those obligations are met, you can transfer the data outside of that country. And we have seen that happening in the case of, let's say, your European Union, Brazil, etc. So these are the like sort of different forms and shapes of data localization, which the financial services sector has seen in the past. Moving on, what are the impacts of data localization we have seen on the financial services industry? So one of the things which we have seen that data localization has been a sort of creating restriction or prohibition for local as well as the global companies. So for example, let's say, for example, if there is a domestic or an Indian company which is planning to, let's say, expand to the other markets, etc., and assuming that that particular market has certain data localization requirements, so that particular market, it becomes difficult for that entity or that Indian company to enter that particular market, because in case if it wants to enter that particular market, it will have to comply with the local data localization requirements, etc. And same applies for, let's say, any other company willing to, let's say, enter into, let's say, country like India, etc., where there are certain restrictions on data localization. So let's say any multinational company in the financial, if they want to enter into the financial services or digital payments ecosystem, while they can enter into the country, but they will have to comply with the local regulations around data localization, etc. So which actually makes the business operations for both the local and the global companies expensive, and which could prove to be like sort of prohibitive in terms of carrying out the business operations. The second impact which we have seen is that the data localization, or let's say, for example, your if one country, if multiple countries come up with, let's say, the data localization requirement, that results in your fragmented data processing, and which could have impact on your data security and reliability. because what we are essentially trying to do is we are trying to create more surfaces or more touch points for, let's say, your fraudsters or let's say your hackers, etc., to breach into your system, etc. So fragmented data processing is actually, we are actually creating more vulnerabilities for the entire ecosystem for the hackers, etc., to like sort of intrude into the systems, etc. One of my fellow panelists already like sort of talked about that security of data does not depends on the physical location of the data. So let's say, for example, if there is any government or the regulator which is trying to say that if I mandate the local storage and processing of data in my country, that will secure the data. So basically, this is a myth. So the physical location of that data does not necessarily ensure the security of the data. And the last impact of the data localization is that especially when I talk about from the financial services point of view, so it actually hinders our fraud detection models. So what I mean to say is that, let's say, for example, today when we process the transactions globally, we train our AI and ML models based on the information which we collect from all the markets where we operate globally. And that is how we like sort of keep on improving our fraud detection models and artificial intelligence using the techniques on AI and ML. And like sort of this once we, let's say, create certain fragmentations in, let's say, the processing and storage, etc., we are actually compromising on that particular aspect. And what I mean to say by that is, let's say, for example, if a particular country or a regulator has mandated the data to be processed, financial data to be processed locally, and then my ability to like train my AI and ML models is restricted to the data available from that country only. I cannot train the models of that particular country on the global data. So that actually takes away our capability or the company's capability to train those models based on the global data. Now, what are the different policy alternatives which we have to, in order to, let's say, for example, navigate the challenges of data localization? What are the policy alternatives do we have? The first thing is that as a government and as a regulator, they need to have a balanced national data protection and privacy law. And that could only be done if the policymakers conduct a comprehensive consultation with the industry, with the government agencies, etc., and they try to, let's say, consider what their concerns are, expectations are, etc., and try to address those concerns and expectations through their data protection and privacy laws. Many of you may be aware that as recent as of last week, India has finally put in place a personal data protection law in place after a very long journey of consultations and coming to the parliament, then going again back for the consultation and all that stuff. While it is true that the government has talked about allowing cross-border flow of data to the other countries, however, at the same time, if you look at the law, it also says that if for a particular sector, if there are any higher degree of restrictions or stricter provisions, those will continue to, let's say, be maintained. And what that essentially means is, let's say, for example, if the Reserve Bank of India has taken a data localization measure in 2018, so that will continue to prevail and that will not be done away with even after the law is passed. And at the same time, the law also gives the sectoral regulators the powers to have to create their own guidelines, policies, etc., which could be more stricter in nature as compared to what has been stated in the law. The second thing which we can think of is that the corporates and the companies, etc., also need to like show voluntarily that they have put in place robust privacy and security frameworks in order to allay any concerns which, let's say, the consumers, etc., have when they are, let's say, using the financial services or the payments platform, etc., for conducting the payment transactions. So this is more in terms of that the companies also need to show that they care about the customer data. The third thing is that the governments also need to bring in incentives for the companies to comply with the data use and on the transfer regulations, etc., by having in place a data protection authority. I think most of the countries which are coming up with the data protection laws are coming up with a framework around data protection authority. But my view is that the data protection authority will only be helpful if it has got some enforcement powers rather than just monitoring powers. The other thing which we can look upon in order to put in place is that we need to have more public-private partnerships in cybersecurity space so that it can help in strengthening the customer confidence and maintain security assurance at all the times whenever let's say the customers are transacting on various payments platforms, etc. And then finally, we need to also expand the multilateral agreements to alleviate any concerns around storage, processing, and use of data by the companies. So yeah, that's all from my side, and happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rakesh. I think it was good that you provided some possible policy alternatives to data localization restrictions. And also thank you for providing your sector's context on this issue. So now I will move on to the last segment of our program, which is the panel discussion and Q&A. So for that, I'd first like to introduce our moderator for the section. John Garrity is Chief of Party for USAID Philippines Better Access and Connectivity, or Beacon Activity, USAID program to improve digital connectivity infrastructure, the ICT enabling environment, and cybersecurity capacity in the Philippines. His background is as an economist, policy advisor, and project manager with 20 years of experience working on economic development issues in the public sector at the state, federal, international levels, and in the private sector. His focus is on digital inclusion programs, universal access policy, and last mile connectivity deployments to foster effective universal internet adoption for inclusive growth and poverty alleviation. So now I'll hand off the floor to John, and then I'd like to ask all the speakers who have stayed with us to please join the discussion by opening your camera. So thank you. John, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Randall. Thank you to all the speakers. I think we've learned a lot across all the presentations about the benefits of cross-border data flows, some of the issues with data localization and data sovereignty policies that are being considered, and then also approaches to define a balanced approach between the different issues that have been raised by governments across the region. If I could just encourage everybody that's still with us from the speaker side to turn on your cameras so we know who's around. There's a lot of questions that have already been posed in the Q&A chat box. So I'll also encourage the audience to continue to ask questions. Some of these questions are being answered directly in the Q&A box, but we'll also talk about some of them in the discussion here. So maybe to go back to some of the earlier presentations, certainly by the World Bank and then also OECD, we saw some of the categorizations that were presented in the analyses of where countries fall, where different countries in Southeast Asia and around the world are sort of rank on the basis of their enabling policies for cross-border data flows. And then also we heard about the various different sort of trade policies and agreements that are being put in place. We also heard from Princess and also Rakesh on some of the examples of countries that maybe have adjusted their policy approach to enable greater cross-border data flows to support economic growth. So I just wanted to go back to one of the questions that was posed in the Q&A box with regard to jurisdictions, to countries that have reviewed or maybe have rolled back their restrictive policy environments to facilitate greater cross-border data flows. We heard of some examples, I believe, from Indonesia and India, but it'd be useful to hear more about what's happened in those cases and if there are other countries that are looking to take a more enabling approach because of all the information that's being shared about the benefits of cross-border data flows. So this is a question to the audience, but certainly I know Janos and Otto, and I see Jared, you have your hand up. So Jared, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, this example goes back a little bit, but I thought it would be useful. Back during when the U.S. was negotiating a negotiating partner within the CPTPP, the U.S. Department of Treasury was reluctant to allow financial services to be included in the e-commerce chapter provisions related to data transfers and data localization requirements. And I presume it had to do with their sense that they needed to have access to that information. Now, before the U.S. precipitously pulled out of that very important agreement, the Treasury Department had become persuaded that in fact, contractual arrangements with the regulated sectors that allowed them to have access did not require data localization requirements, and therefore they were persuaded through a variety of side letters to agree that the provisions of the e-commerce chapter would apply to the financial sector. Now that all kind of went away when the US pulled out, but it was then replicated in some bilateral arrangements, for example, between the US Department of Treasury and Singapore's monetary authority. So it's not exactly the context of like a country taking data restrictive policies and releasing them, but it is, I think, a good case study of how regulators, nervous regulators, with legitimate policy concerns can, through an appropriate consultative process, come to understand that there are other mechanisms to achieve their policy objectives that don't necessarily involve data localization requirements. And this is not just a developing and emerging country problem. This is a United States problem or a Europe problem, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Jared. Any other perspectives on countries maybe in Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific region that are reconsidering their approach or have reconsidered their approach?
So maybe I'll go first and then talk about based on the recent data protection law which we have passed. So there were a lot of these discussions, etc., which was happening for quite a long time, and there were concerns among the companies and corporates, etc., with what path India is going to take, especially considering the data localization requirements that were put in place by the RBI in 2018. But interestingly, when the law was passed last week, it allows for cross-border flow of data to those to all the countries, except if there are any countries which the Indian government decides to put it in a restrictive list or a negative list. So it's very interesting, the path which India has chosen. So India will come out with a negative list of countries as well, where they will restrict the cross-border flow of data. We obviously know which those countries are going to be as part of the negative list, and I'm sure that's not going to be more than a couple of countries. Having said that, so this is a welcome development in terms of the thought process of the government. However, having said that, they are also trying to sort of protect the regulations which are already there in place. So they don't want a situation wherein the data localization guidelines of the RBI get diluted because of this law. So they are sort of trying to give powers to the sectoral regulators if they wish to have more stricter form of regulations for their particular sectors.
Yeah. Hi, Jared. Maybe I can share a bit about the Southeast Asian region specifically. So, among the six, or depending on how about you count, the Philippines really is the most open, has the most open policies on cross-border data flows. That said, Indonesia, of course, has very strict data localization laws, as well as Vietnam. But we've seen recently with the recent privacy laws they passed, though they haven't entirely removed it, they've started to ease it. So, for example, in Vietnam, I think the localization requirements now only pertain to telcos and some specific sectors, as well as in Indonesia, we see it only in the financial services industry, as well as some government data. But as opposed to a blanket restriction in the past, so we see the move of governments trying to ease the restrictions, and hopefully, the hope is they remove it entirely in the future. But so we see very limited applications of localization laws within the region. And so again, the Philippines is really on the right path. And as I said, it's a shame if we backtrack. And speaking of ASEAN, there's a move at the ASEAN level. And Jared probably would know more about this than me, but there's a move to have a cross-border data flow mechanism across the ASEAN states. And so with that agreement, I guess that's why most of the governments are starting to look into easing the restrictions in preparation for this ASEAN cross-border data transfer mechanism.
Thanks, Princess. Janos?
Yes, thank you, John. Just maybe a perspective on what we see from the OECD side. We see maybe a distinction between the regulatory dynamic that affects cross-border data flows and on the one hand, and data localization on the other. And we see a slightly different dynamic. If you look at cross-border data flows, we see more discussions taking place on an international level towards finding more interoperable mechanisms for the flow of information. And particularly, you see different kind of mechanisms or models being formed, for instance, around the broader form of what we see, for instance, using different open safeguards to ensure that data can flow across borders, for instance, through standard contractual clauses or similar kind of mechanisms that exist. But if you move into the data localization realm, what we see is that increasingly there is a sense that certain types of data, certain sectors will be more subjected to data localization measures, and particularly some of the sectors that are more strategically relevant, we see an increase when it comes to government's efforts to impose localization mechanisms on this. And this is a global issue. It's not only in Southeast Asia. It happens also across the OECD countries. It's something that I think it has to deal also a little bit with more geopolitical concerns as well. But I just wanted to maybe highlight this separation between what we see on cross-border data flows and data localization, just to separate maybe the two.
Thanks, Janos. And I think that that sort of dynamic between the two topics relates somewhat to one of the other questions that we see in the Q&A box posed by the audience. There's a question, and maybe this primarily goes to Princess for the IT BPO sector, but also it'd be great to get perspectives from the other speakers. The question talks about this point of data localization, if applied or is applied to government agencies in the Philippines through, of course, the DICT DO of 2020 that was presented by our colleague from the Cybersecurity Bureau, DICT, that has the data classification scheme. So the question is, if the Philippines imposes data localization only in government agencies, as that DO relates to, will it still have a cross-border data flow impact to the entire nation or other sectors like the IT BPO sector?
Yeah, thanks, John. That's a tricky question because we've seen, governments around the world really, as Jonas said, impose data localization requirements on certain types of data, most specifically, government data, pertaining to national security and the like. So while it might not have a direct impact, I think the way we see it is, data localization is just one step away from government access to data. It opens the Pandora's box. I said, if a country starts talking about localization in a specific sector, who's to say, what's to stop them from expanding the scope of that localization policy? And I think as well, some, BPO companies handle government data from around the world. We serve, we give outsourcing service to some governments around the world. So in terms of health data, we do have that. And so if you start mandating localization policies for Philippine government data, I'm not sure if, what the effect would be on a government and a foreign government who was our client, from thinking about, whether they should outsource data to the Philippines, given the stance of the government on Philippine government data. As I said, it opens a Pandora's box.
Okay. So it's hard to separate out just government data from where and who's processing and storing. Maybe to turn to Naoto at the World Bank, since you haven't taken my invites to answer the other questions. But we really appreciate the World Bank's perspective in this discussion, certainly because of the economic impacts that you present, and then also some of the social development impacts that you mentioned. One of the questions in the Q&A box maybe sort of steps back and asks, at a higher level, right? What, in terms of the benefits for micro, small, and medium enterprises? So with data localization, could micro, small, and medium enterprises, as well as government agencies, really leverage the benefits of transformative technologies such as AI and machine learning, Internet of Things, if those services are primarily available from trusted providers offshore? So it's the broader question: are those technologies available to MSMEs and government agencies if the providers are offshore?
It's a complicated question for which straightforward and simple answer is very difficult. And I mean, of course, with the localization requirement in place, it will be more difficult for anyone to benefit from any kind of technologies, application of which have to cross borders. But there are ways to, in a way, deal with it through private contractual arrangement and all this, but under certain conditions, right? So from the economic and productivity perspective, it would be always desirable to have as little as possible restrictions to maximize opportunities and economic potentials. But also, this question actually also relates to a couple of other questions that I see in the book. What happens only the government is restricted, but private sector not? Or what is our assessment of the current level of restrictions in Southeast Asia? I do concur what our OECD colleague said on the differentiation between means and ends. The complexity of this topic is data localization topic kind of have direct and indirect effects to different kind of policy objectives. So depending on whether you want to end poverty, whether you want to promote international trade, whether you want to protect intellectual property, whether you want to promote competition, whether you want to assure human rights violation not being taken place by misuse of data, or whether limitation of language and data availability in a particular set of languages, international, local, affects kind of biased algorithm to exclude particular subgroups in the population, such as indigenous people. So these are all different considerations when different national authority mandated to maximize certain policy objectives had to work across the government structure, because all of these are interrelated, and also there are overarching umbrella regime on data classification and data protection, let's say safeguarding personal data versus enabling the flow of private or public intent data. These are interrelated in a complicated manner, and the data stewardship to orchestrate national integrated data systems primarily within the government, but also interfacing public and private sector data, also are so heterogeneous across countries. In the Philippines, we have the cloud first policy, but also there's earlier underlying data classification framework, which was instituted decades ago, I believe, which is, I believe, still in effect. So, and then also for each of these policy objectives affected by cross-border data flows, of course, the data localization is not the only means to maximize whatever the subset of the policy objectives. So that's a long way to answer. It's a difficult question to simply answer. What I could also share related is, could you allow me to share my screen for like 15, 30 seconds, if it might help? Related to I mean, what the World Bank is thinking, not yet publishing, in terms of the current assessment, because there was the World Development Report, there was the Southeast Asia Focused Cross-Border Data Flow Report. What we are preparing now is an updated version of what we called GDRD, Global Data Regulations Report, which is more in-depth look of not only cross-border data flow, but also broader data regulation policy landscape, which I'm also, in a way, relatively new to this domain, but helping me to catch up on this landscape. So I thought just a quick snapshot of what I can show on screen might be useful. Let me try to do the screen sharing here.
Just a quick snapshot, Naoto.
Yep. Yes. So in relation to different means and different ends, these are a set of different means under the bigger umbrella of the data governance policy space related to safeguard and enablers. And of course, the cross-border data flows as sub-bucketed on one side is misleading because everything written in this box is bears a lot of cross-border implications. You can find these definitions from the global data regulation report. What we see interesting, what we are starting to see interesting in this particular region is if we average out the policy kind of evaluation scores, both on safeguard and enabler scores across the globe and in the sub-regions in East Asia and Pacific. Well, there's advanced economies, there's China, but the developing East Asian economies, primarily ASEAN and also Pacific Island countries, seems to be converging around higher level of enablers and lower level of safeguards, and enablers are driven by e-commerce and commercial transactions. And the weaker safeguard is not necessarily due to cybersecurity, but the personal, non-personal and personal data protection. But of course, the countries vary. Philippines are, in a way, the level of sophistication comparable to the US. And most other countries are not. And then doing more on enablers, but less on the safeguarding. But this is an old snapshot that was collected for 2021 publication. We are now preparing the 2023 snapshot. So that should also shed light on what the latest and how other countries may be either catching up or not. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Naoto, and thanks for the flag of the report. And then also, yeah, we noted in your presentation the other two reports that were referenced and the resources, the number of resources that were shared across by all of the presenters and the report. So that's something that that we'll also collate and share. I did promise our organizers that we would end on time, but I wanted to make sure that everybody gets a chance to convey some parting thoughts. And really, we'll want to start with we'll start with Benjamin, and we'll maybe go in reverse order from the speakers. There are also some other questions in the Q&A that are still open that would benefit from the speakers going in and answering them. So really, I mean, what we wanted to do to close is to just get final words from each of you to maybe reflect on this point that we've seen in the categorizations and in some of the comments from the speakers that the Philippines is really one of the leading countries in the region when it comes to having this enabling environment for cross-border data flows to drive economic and social development. And so just wanted to get your parting thoughts on how you would recommend taking somewhat of this balanced approach that Rakesh was sharing in his final slide about ways to move forward from here, right? I mean, what to do to move forward from here to sort of maintain that position to enable the benefits to continue and increase. So let's start with Benjamin.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. I'll just share from my experience as a startup co-founder and someone who actually did real estate in the Philippines. So 5-6 years ago, the private equity fund that I was in invested in several BPO spaces. The private equity invested in a BPO, the private equity real estate invested in a BPO space. So I've seen firsthand how BPO spaces and how BPO itself has uplifted the Philippines. And not just that, it has uplifted the lives of many people across the world. Yeah, I don't know what the world would do without Philippines BPO. Yeah, it's whatever like Princess was mentioning, honestly, that is like amazing. And I think in this age where you have like AI and all these other things that go forward, I'm not a policy maker myself, but I think what I can share is really something where it's from the ground as a startup CEO, where in essence, let's say for Kinovi, we have developers in Vietnam, we have customer success team in the Philippines, we also have people who are growing the business in revenues in Indonesia. If any part of the data is not allowed to be speaking to each other across borders, there would be an issue, because like imagine my customer success team is not able to service my clients in Indonesia. Imagine if my developers are not able to really work on the bugs and fix the things in another country. That becomes a huge issue. I think that this is a similar model that we see in several other startups and SMEs that make up 70% of every single country itself. So I think within that, this is really the reality that we are facing. Of course, I don't have the quick answers. Rakesh has great comments and what the next steps forward are. But I think what I can say is that this is reality that we're facing, and any policy that's being made would definitely affect any startup, even for myself.
Gotcha. Thanks, Benjamin, for your perspective. Rakesh, I know you're the last one to actually speak, so let me go back to you, and you had that slide. But what's the one thing that you would recommend? Is it the consultative approach for any policy changes? What would it be?
So definitely consultative approach is the bottom line that I think every government and the regulator need to follow. And that consultative approach has to be very thorough, very comprehensive. But having said that, what I also would like to emphasize on is that as an industry, we also need to, let's say, try and find out from the government and the regulator, what is the objective they are trying to achieve by, let's say, implementing certain data localization requirements. And if we are clear about those objectives the government is trying to achieve, then as an industry, do we have some other alternatives which we can suggest to the policymakers so that those alternatives can address their expectations without getting into any restrictive data localization requirements? So I think it's a both-way communication which needs to happen with the policymakers and the industry, trying to understand the objectives of those data localization requirements. And the industry also has to come up proactively in terms of addressing those objectives without getting into data localization. So I think that is the key. Thank you.
Thanks, Rakesh. Princess, one thing from the IBAP perspective.
Yeah, so I guess for IBPAP, we just want the government's continued support to the industry. I mean, the president has stated his State of the Nation address that our industry is one of the most important industries to the Philippines, and we just hope for continued support and continued consultation. You know, as Rakesh said, it's important that we be consulted thoroughly before the government decides on any new policies. And I echo the call again to really identify what the objective of this new policy would be. And, you know, I guess the important thing to think about this is, you know, location doesn't have anything to do with security or access to data. It's really you know, who owns the data, what kind of security measures they put. So regardless of the intent of the government, we believe as an industry that you know, cross-border flow of data is the most beneficial to us. And I echo again, it's a separate issue from data localization. But again, in an ideal world, we don't have any of those policies, and that will allow really our industry to grow exponentially and without limit.
Thank you, Princess. Jared?
Yeah, so just a couple of quick things. a lot of times I think data localization and data transfer restrictions are go-to policies that are then justified. And I would encourage policymakers to really focus on what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and then thinking about what are the policies that enable those outcomes. And oftentimes, if you look at these things objectively, data localization requirements and data transfer restrictions are not the preferred solution. The other thing, and this gets a little bit to the government, governments lead by example. So when you're talking about restrictions, it's hard to imagine any country putting nuclear codes or whatever, highly sensitive national security information on the cloud. But do you want a pyramid where the restrictions apply to the most sensitive data and you have a relatively open system for less sensitive information, which sounds kind of where the Philippines is? Or do you want an inverted pyramid where everything is restricted except the most open data? That's the Korea approach. Don't do the Korea approach. And the last point I want to make is the consultative approach. Australia has been an incredible leader in this regard on the cybersecurity related issues, and at any rate. But even countries as developed as Singapore and others have tended to focus on the very end users when they're looking at cybersecurity policies, and not thinking about the impact on the service providers that are enabling those end users, the critical infrastructure providers or others, to do their job. So make sure when you're doing a consultation, you're looking several layers down the chain, so that you're not imposing policies that the end users say, okay, sure, no problem, we can do that, but then you're totally messing up the systems that actually enable them to secure their data.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you, Jared. Janos, anything else? One thing that should be focused on by policymakers?
Just one, John?
Final words.
I think one important point in this discussion is really the evidence that we have, and to communicate that evidence to the policymakers. I think there's a mounting amount of information out there that points in one direction and points out the benefits of making sure that governments understand that there are costs to data localization and there are huge benefits of allowing data to flow. I think it's really important to convey that evidence in a concise and easy to understand manner, so that governments really understand what's at stake. And I think the other challenge for governments is sometimes to coordinate and manage that message across different regulatory agencies within the country. Given that often, for instance, specific sectors have specific regulators that might have different objectives or different interests. So conveying that evidence and seeing the bigger picture is really an essential point in making sure that data localization is not going to be something that inhibits innovation.
Great. And Naoto, final word is yours.
Sure, thank you. I think consultative approach is the word of the day. And when doing it, my advice would be also not only to look inward, but look outward, acknowledge that the role that Philippines has been playing as the regional leader on the free flow of the cross-border data flows. And this is consequential debates, not only domestically, but with regional and global implications. So be mindful and broaden the consultations. And the World Bank would be happy to be continuing to be involved in this conversation. Thank you.
Right, excellent. Good point. Excellent point on the spillover effects. So that concludes our panel session. I want to first of all thank all of the speakers and the panelists for all of the time that you took to prepare, to present today, to convey your messages. Also want to thank the organizers of this event and all of the participants who joined. One of the things that we wanted to convey to all of the audience is that, I think to Jonas's point, the organizers are going to be developing a policy brief that will capture a lot of this information. There's also a press release that will be coming out from this workshop. So please do follow the Arangkada website for those documents to come out. And we hope that this discussion today just sparks a conversation that continues about how to to ensure that the Philippines continues to play this role as a leader in having an enabling policy environment for cross-border data flows moving forward. So with that, I want to thank everybody, and we can close the webinar 7 minutes after the hour. Thank you all very much, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very much,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.